The sun bled across the horizon, painting the arid plains in hues of blood and rust, a constant reminder of the harsh bargains this land demanded. In the town of Redemption, dust settled on everything with the lazy patience of a patient predator. It coated the unpainted clapboard of the general store, filled the ruts in the main street, and powdered the shoulders of Jedediah Kane as he swept the boardwalk in front of the saloon. He moved with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man trying to forget the speed he once possessed. His hands, which had once been steady enough to draw and fire a Colt in the space of a single heartbeat, now felt clumsy gripping the worn handle of a broom. He was a ghost in a town that had no memory of the man he used to be. U.S. Marshal Jedediah Kane was dead, burned away in the same fire that had claimed his wife, his career, and his soul. All that remained was Kane, a man with haunted eyes and a past he kept buried under a mountain of quiet shame. The quiet of the afternoon was a fragile thing, and it shattered without warning. Glass exploded from the front windows of the Redemption Bank and Trust. A woman screamed a high, thin sound that was swallowed by the roar of a shotgun blast. Jedediah's hand went to a gun that wasn't there, a phantom limb aching with the memory of its purpose. His head snapped up his body, tensing with an instinct he had spent 5 years trying to kill. 3 men spilled out of the bank act, their faces hidden by dusty bandanas. 2 of them herded the terrified tellers into the street, their pistols waving menacingly. The 3rd man, the leader, stepped out last. He moved with an unnerving grace, not like a common thug, but like a conductor commanding an orchestra of chaos. He was tall and lean, dressed in a black duster that seemed to absorb the fierce sunlight. He pulled down his bandana, revealing a face that was handsome in a severe way, with intelligent eyes and a mouth that smiled as if he knew a secret the rest of the world was too foolish to comprehend. A fine afternoon for commerce, wouldn't you say? He called out to the stunned townsfolk cowering in doorways. His voice was not a gravelly bark, but a rich baritone laced with an unsettling eloquence. We are merely facilitating a withdrawal. This was Silas Blackwood. Jedediah knew the name. It was a name whispered in saloons and law offices from the territories to the capital, a phantom who struck with surgical precision and disappeared like smoke. Jedediah remained frozen, broom in hand, a spectator to the violence he had once been sworn to prevent. But then something happened that defied the logic of a simple robbery. Silas didn't direct his men to flee with the sacks of money. Instead, he turned back to the bank manager, a trembling bald man named Abernathy, and pressed the barrel of a silver-inlaid pistol to his temple. "The special deposits, Mr. Abernathy. Box 73, if you please, and do be quick. Providence waits for no man." Abernathy, his face ashen, stumbled back inside. Silas followed, leaving his men to stand guard. A moment later, he emerged not with a box of gold or bonds, but with a single small object held between his thumb and forefinger. He held it up to the light, letting the sun glint off its surface. It was a silver locket. From 50 feet away, Jedediah could see the delicate engraving on its surface, a solitary willow tree, its branches weeping toward the ground. His breath caught in his throat, a sharp, ragged thing. The world narrowed to that single point of light. Sarah's locket, the one he had given her on their first anniversary, the one she had been wearing the night she died. It was supposed to have been buried with her, but the undertaker said it had been lost in the flames, melted beyond recognition. A lie. It had been in the safe deposit box, a relic too painful for him to look at, yet impossible for him to part with. Silas Blackwood pocketed the locket. He gave a slight, almost theatrical bow to the street. "Our business here is concluded. My apologies for the inconvenience." He mounted his horse, his men following suit, and they galloped out of town, leaving a cloud of dust and stunned silence in their wake. The spell broke. People rushed forward, shouting, crying. The young Deputy Miller, barely 20 and still trying to grow into his badge, ran from his office, fumbling with his gun belt. But Jedediah didn't move. The broom slipped from his grasp and clattered onto the boardwalk. This wasn't a robbery. This wasn't random. This was a message delivered with a cruel and intimate precision. Silas Blackwood hadn't just stolen money from a bank. He had reached back 5 years and clawed open a grave. He had stolen the last piece of Jedediah's wife, and in doing so, he had stolen Jedediah's peace. The ghost of Marshall Kane stirred. The dust of redemption felt like a shroud he had to tear away. For the first time in 5 years, the fire in his soul wasn't just the one that had taken his wife. It was the one that now demanded a reckoning. Deputy Miller, his face flushed with a mixture of fear and youthful indignation, approached Jedediah. "Mr. Kane, did you see which way they went? I need to form a posse. We can't let them." "A posse won't find him." Jedediah set his voice a low rasp, rusty from disuse. He looked at the boy, at the unearned confidence shining in his eyes, and saw a reflection of a man he no longer was. "This isn't about the money, son." He turned and walked toward the livery stable, his long, dormant purpose straightening his spine. He wasn't just Kane the sweeper anymore. He was Jedediah Kane, and a debt had just come due. The livery smelled of hay sweat and leather odors that stirred memories Jedediah had long since buried. He saddled a rangy roan, his movements stiff at first, then smoother as muscle memory took over. He checked the worn leather of his gun belt, the one he hadn't worn since the fire, and slid his old Colt Peacemaker from its oiled holster. The weight of it in his hand was familiar, a terrible comfort. It felt like shaking hands with a demon he thought he had escaped. Deputy Miller followed him in his expression earnest. "Mr. Kane, you can't go after them alone. Blackwood has a dozen men, maybe more. They say he's ruthless." "He is," Jedediah said, not looking at the boy. He cinched the saddle tight. "He's also a man who likes to make a point. That means he won't be running fast. He'll be waiting for me to understand the lesson." "What lesson?" Jedediah finally turned to face him. The haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by a cold, hard focus. That some graves don't stay buried. He swung himself into the saddle, the movement feeling both alien and deeply natural. He didn't have a badge. He didn't have the authority of the law. All he had was a name, a ghost, and a stolen silver locket that served as a map to his own personal hell. As he rode out of redemption, leaving the frantic deputy shouting behind him, the setting sun cast his long shadow before him, a dark finger pointing the way into the unforgiving wilderness. The hunt had begun. The trail left by Blackwood's gang was arrogant in its clarity, a broad slash through the sagebrush that any greenhorn could follow. It was a deliberate invitation. Jedediah knew it. Blackwood wasn't just fleeing. He was leading, choreographing a dance whose steps only he seemed to know. For 2 days, Jedediah rode, pushing his horse and himself through shimmering heat that rose from the alkali flats and into nights so cold they felt like a physical blow. The landscape was a canvas of muted browns and grays, broken only by the skeletal arms of Joshua trees reaching for a merciless sky. His mind, long dulled by routine and cheap whiskey, began to sharpen. He saw the world again through a marshal's eyes, a set of tracks veering off from the main group, the way a hawk circled high above, indicating a water source hidden in the rocks. The skills were still there, buried, but not gone. Yet with their return came the ghosts. With every mile, the memory of Sarah grew more vivid. He remembered the way she'd laughed, the scent of lavender in her hair, the feel of her hand tracing the willow tree on the locket as he gave it to her. "So, I'll always have a piece of our home to carry with me," she had whispered. On the 3rd day, the trail split. The main party continued north, but a single set of tracks cut west toward a desolate stretch of badlands known as the Devil's Jaw. It was a trap, obvious and crude. Blackwood was testing him, seeing if the old marshal still had his instincts. Jedediah dismounted, studying the ground. The horse that went west was shod with a distinctive V-notch on its left hind shoe, a blacksmith's mark he'd seen before. The main group's horses were all unmarked, a decoy. He ignored the false trail and followed the main tracks north, his jaw set. An hour later, his caution paid off. 2 men were waiting in ambush in a narrow canyon position to catch anyone following the decoy trail. They were careless, confident, their conversation drifting on the still air. Jedediah tethered his horse and circled around on foot, his boots silent on the sandstone. He came up behind them, the colt feeling cold and heavy in his hand. Looking for someone, he asked, his voice flat. The 2 men spun around, their eyes wide with surprise. They were young, barely older than Deputy Miller, their faces smudged with dirt and bravado. They reached for their guns. It was a fool's move. Jedediah's pistol was already leveled. "Don't," he warned. "I just want to talk." The taller one, emboldened by his partner's presence, sneered. "We ain't talking to no one, old man." His hand twitched. Jedediah's shot was not aimed to kill. He fired into the rock just beside the man's head. Stone chips flew, stinging the outlaw's cheek. The man cried out, stumbling back, his bravado vanishing in a puff of dust. His partner froze, hands raised high. "I'll ask again." Jedediah said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Where is he headed?" The one he'd shot at was shaking, his eyes darting nervously. "He didn't say. Just told us to wait here, slow down anyone who followed." "And the locket?" Jedediah's voice tightened around the word. "Why did he take it?" The second man, a wiry fellow with shifty eyes, spoke up. "Don't know nothing about a locket. Silas. He has his reasons for things. He talks about debts, about balancing the scales of justice when God ain't watching." The phrase echoed what he'd heard whispered about Blackwood. It wasn't the talk of a common thief. It was the language of a zealot. Jedediah tied them up securely, leaving them with a canteen of water. They would be found by a posse eventually. As he took their horses to prevent a quick escape, he saw something tucked into one of the saddlebags, a faded tin-type photograph of a woman with a small child on her lap. They were smiling. It was the kind of picture a man carries to remember what he's fighting for or what he's lost. He stared at it for a long moment, an uneasy feeling prickling his skin, before tucking it back and riding on. The trail was no longer a simple line in the dust. It was a thread pulling him deeper into a story he was only just beginning to understand. His path led him further into the plains, toward the foothills of the Dragoon Mountains. The land grew gentler here, dotted with cottonwoods and the promise of water. It was in this relative oasis that he saw a thin plume of smoke rising against the evening sky. It wasn't a campfire. It was the smoke of a chimney, a homestead. As he drew closer, he saw a small, sturdy cabin and a newly built barn nestled in a hollow. A flicker of light shone from a window. Caution told him to bypass it, to stick to the trail. But his water was low, and his horse was exhausted. He decided to risk it, approaching slowly, his hand resting near the butt of his colt. Before he could hail the house, the front door opened. An elderly man with a shock of white hair and a weathered face stepped onto the porch, a rifle held loosely in his arms. He wasn't aiming it, but its presence was a clear statement. "That's far enough, stranger," the man called out, his voice steady. Jedediah raised an open hand. "Mean no harm. Just looking for water and maybe some information. I'm tracking a man named Silas Blackwood." At the name, the old man's grip on the rifle tightened. An elderly woman appeared in the doorway behind him, her face etched with worry. "Elias, who is it?" "He's tracking the man who raided the Miller place." Elias said to her, his eyes never leaving Jedediah. He gestured with his head to the north. "You're too late. Blackwood's gang came through here 2 nights ago. Hit the farmstead a mile down the creek, left nothing behind but ash and sorrow." A cold dread settled in Jedediah's stomach. "Anyone make it out?" Elias's face softened with a deep sadness. "Just the boy. Cody. He's inside. Found him wandering in the dust, half-starved and mute with terror." Just then, a small face peeked around the woman's skirts. A boy of about 8 with wide, frightened eyes and a smudge of soot on his cheek. He looked at Jedediah, at the gun on his hip and the hard set of his jaw, and immediately shrank back. The woman, Martha, stepped forward. Her eyes were kind. "You look worn to the bone, mister. Blackwood is long gone, but the devil can wait until you've had a hot meal. Come inside." Jedediah hesitated. Getting involved was a mistake. These people, this boy, they were a complication he couldn't afford. But the smell of stew drifted from the cabin, and the weariness in his bones was a powerful argument. He dismounted and followed them inside. The cabin was warm and clean, a small sanctuary of peace in a violent land. Elias and Martha Greaves moved with the easy grace of a couple who had shared a lifetime of hardships and joys. They asked few questions, offering him a bowl of stew and a chunk of fresh bread. The boy Cody sat by the hearth, watching Jedediah with a silent, unnerving intensity. He was a mirror of what Jedediah felt inside a survivor, haunted by a fire he couldn't outrun. As Jedediah ate, he learned that Blackwood's raid had been swift and brutal. They hadn't just taken livestock. They had burned the farmhouse to the ground. Elias spoke of Blackwood with a kind of baffled horror. He wasn't like other raiders. He spoke to John Miller before the end. Talked about fire being a purifier. Quoted scripture while his men lit the torches. It wasn't robbery. It was a sermon delivered with gunpowder. Jedediah felt the pieces clicking into place. The locket, the talk of debts, and now this, a sermon of fire. It was all connected, and the connection was pulling tighter around him. He knew he should leave, that his presence put this family in danger. Blackwood had passed through once. He might circle back. "I should go," Jedediah said, pushing his empty bowl away. "Thank you for the meal." "Nonsense," Martha said firmly. "Your horse is spent and you look no better. You'll stay the night. We're not afraid. This home is built on faith and stubbornness. It's held against worse than him." That night, Jedediah lay on a cot near the fire, the colt resting on the floor beside him. He couldn't sleep. The quiet breathing of the old couple and the boy filled the small cabin. It was the kind of domestic peace he had once known and taken for granted. He watched Cody, who was curled under a quilt, his small body occasionally twitching in the grip of a nightmare. This boy had lost everything to the same man who held the key to Jedediah's past. Their paths had converged here in this small pocket of warmth. He felt a pull, a sense of responsibility that he hadn't felt in years. It was more than just getting the locket back. It was about stopping the fire from spreading about, ensuring that what happened to his family and to Cody's would not happen again. He had started this journey for revenge, a selfish need to reclaim a piece of his past. But looking at the sleeping boy, he realized it had to be about the future, a future this boy deserved to have. The next morning, as the sun cast long shadows across the valley, a rider appeared on the ridge. It was not Silas Blackwood. It was one of his scouts moving with a lazy confidence. He rode down toward the homestead, clearly expecting no resistance. Elias saw him first. "Jedediah," he called quietly from the porch. Jedediah was already moving. He met Elias outside, motioning for Martha to take Cody to the back room. "He's testing your defenses," Jedediah said in a low voice, "seeing if you're an easy target for supplies on their way back through." "What do we do?" Elias asked, his hand tight on his old rifle. "We show him we're not," Jedediah replied. He stepped out from the cover of the porch, positioning himself in the center of the yard, his duster pushed back to reveal the Colt on his hip. He stood motionless, a silent challenge. The rider reined in his horse 100 yards out, his easy posture stiffening. He had expected a simple farmer, not a man who stood like a statue carved from granite and gunpowder. After a long, tense moment, the scout slowly turned his horse and rode back the way he came, disappearing over the ridge. The immediate threat was gone, but the message was clear. They were on Blackwood's map now. "He'll be back," Elias said, his voice grim. "Yes," Jedediah agreed, "but this time we'll be ready." He spent the next 2 days working with Elias, fortifying the homestead. They boarded up the larger windows, reinforced the doors, and planned fields of fire. He taught Elias how to reload his rifle under pressure and showed Martha how to use a shotgun. He took Cody out to the creek and taught him how to be watchful, how to read the signs of the land and the sudden flight of birds, the silence of insects that signaled an approaching stranger. The boy was a quick learner, his fears slowly being replaced by a quiet competence. In those days, Jedediah felt something thaw inside him. Working with his hands, sharing his knowledge, protecting this small-found family, it felt more real than anything he had done in 5 years. On the 3rd evening, as dusk settled like a purple bruise on the land, they came. Not a single scout, but 5 riders led by Silas Blackwood himself. They stopped at the edge of the property, a line of dark silhouettes against the fading light. Jedediah stood on the porch, Elias at his side. Martha and Cody were inside out of sight. Blackwood dismounted, walking forward with that same unnerving, fluid grace. He stopped just out of easy rifle range. His eyes found Jedediah, and a slow, chilling smile spread across his face. It was a smile of recognition, of triumph. "Marshal Kane Silas," called his voice, carrying clearly on the still air. "I wondered how long it would take for my invitation to be accepted. It seems you've found yourself a new flock to protect. A dangerous habit for you, wouldn't you say?" Jedediah's hand hovered over his Colt. "What do you want, Blackwood?" Silas chuckled a low, humorless sound. "What I have always wanted, Marshal. An accounting. You see the fire? It took from us both. The only difference is, I remember who lit the match." The word struck Jedediah like a physical blow. He stared at Silas, at the burning intensity in his eyes, and understood. This was not about a locket. This was about a fire. The fire, the one that had consumed his world. And Silas Blackwood, a man he had thought was a stranger, had been there in the heart of the inferno all along. The air grew heavy with the weight of Silas Blackwood's revelation. The setting sun cast him in silhouette, turning him into a specter of judgment. Jedediah felt the ground shift beneath his feet. This man, this charismatic butcher, was not just a phantom from newspaper clippings. He was a ghost from Jedediah's own past, risen from the ashes of a shared tragedy. "I don't know what you're talking about." Jedediah said, his voice a low growl, but the lie was thin even to his own ears. The photograph in the saddlebag, the talk of sermons and fire, it all coalesced into a terrifying nascent truth. Silas's smile widened, a predator's grimace. "Don't you, Marshal, search your memory? Abilene, 5 years ago, A fire started in the textile mill, a strong wind blowing from the north. The fire department was stretched thin, their pumper broken. And the town marshal? Where was he? Silas took a theatrical step forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that seemed to cut through the distance between them. He was protecting the assets. The bank. The mayor's mansion. He drew a line in the dust and let everything south of it burn. My home was south of that line. My wife. My daughter. Jedediah's blood ran cold. He remembered that night with sickening clarity. The chaos, the screams, the impossible choices. The mayor had ordered him to protect the town's financial center, arguing that if the bank burned, Abilene would never recover. He had followed the order, creating a fire break that saved the north side of town, while the south, the poorer side, was devoured. His own home and Sarah had been caught in the blaze he was supposed to contain. He had always seen it as his personal failure, a tragedy centered on his own loss. He had never truly considered the others. You chose which lives were worth saving. Silas continued, his voice rising with righteous fury. You let my family turn to ash to save a rich man's ledger. So I have taken it upon myself to continue your work. I too am a purveyor of fire. I burn away the rot, the injustice. And I have come to collect the debt you owe. Before Jedediah could process the full weight of the accusation, Silas raised his hand. It was not a signal to attack. It was a gesture of dismissal. But not today. A reckoning requires the proper stage. I will see you soon, Marshal. At a place of my own choosing. With that he turned, mounted his horse, and led his men away, melting back into the twilight. He left behind a silence more profound and terrifying than any gunshot. Inside the cabin, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Elias looked at Jedediah, his face a mask of confusion and concern. What did he mean about the fire? Jedediah sank into a chair, the strength gone from his legs. He felt as if he were seeing his past through a different lens, the picture distorted into something monstrous. He had worn his grief like a shield, a justification for his exile. But Silas wore his grief like a weapon. He's right, Jedediah said, his voice hollow. There was a fire. I made a choice. He didn't need to explain further. The guilt was etched on his face. Martha placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. A man does what he thinks is right in the moment, Jedediah. Hindsight is a luxury the good Lord rarely grants us when it matters. Her words were kind, but they offered little comfort. He knew he could no longer stay. His presence was a magnet for the destruction Silas promised. He was not a protector. He was a beacon for the storm. I have to leave, he announced the next morning. I'll draw him away from here. He wants me, not you. Elias stood before him, blocking his path to the door. And go where you'll be leading a wolf into the wilderness, but a wolf always finds its way back to the fold. You saw that boy, he said, nodding toward Cody, who was watching them with wide, knowing eyes. He needs more than just a roof. He needs to see a good man stand his ground. We all do. Jedediah was torn. The old marshal, the man of duty, knew that leaving was the tactical choice. But the man he was becoming, the man who had started to feel the warmth of this small family, wanted to stay. His indecision was a weakness, and Silas Blackwood was a man who knew how to exploit weakness. The choice was made for him 2 days later. Jedediah was teaching Cody how to track a deer along the creek bed when they found it, a small white ribbon tied to the branch of a cottonwood tree. It was a piece torn from one of Martha's aprons. Below it, scratched into the mud, was a single chilling message, San Augustine. He sprinted back to the cabin, his heart hammering against his ribs. Elias met him at the door, his face pale with dread. She's gone. She went to gather herbs by the mission ruins. She should have been back an hour ago. Silas hadn't waited for Jedediah to come to him. He had taken another piece of his world, forcing the confrontation, ensuring the stage was set to his liking. The old San Augustine mission was a crumbling adobe ruin, a few miles into the foothills, a place said to be haunted by the ghosts of a forgotten war. Now it would be haunted by a new one. A storm was brewing on the horizon. Dark, bruised clouds gathered in the west, and the wind began to whip through the valley, carrying the smell of ozone and dust. It was a fitting backdrop for the final act. "Stay here," Jedediah commanded Elias, his voice devoid of warmth. "All business now. Bar the door. If I'm not back by dawn, take the boy and ride east. Don't stop." He saddled his roan, checking his colt with grim precision. As he mounted, Cody ran to him, his small face tight with fear. He pressed something into Jedediah's hand. It was a small wooden bird he had been carving its form, still rough and unfinished. "For luck," the boy whispered. Jedediah looked down at the small token, then at the boy's terrified eyes. He tucked the bird into his shirt pocket. It felt heavier than any badge. He was no longer fighting for a memory. He was fighting for a future. He rode toward the mission as the first gusts of the dust storm tore at the land. The sky turned a sickly yellow-orange. Dust filled the air, a thick, blinding curtain that reduced visibility to a few yards. The wind howled like a legion of damned souls, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very earth itself. Through the maelstrom, he could just make out the skeletal silhouette of the mission's bell tower, rising against the turbulent sky. The storm was a character in itself, an agent of chaos sent to preside over the reckoning. He dismounted at the mission's crumbling outer wall, tethering his horse in the lee of the stone. The wind tore at his duster, and grit stung his eyes. He drew his colt and moved forward, a shadow in a world of roaring wind and swirling dust. The eerie, discordant tolling of a broken church bell swung wildly by. The gale echoed through the ruins, a death knell for a confrontation 5 years in the making. He found them in the ruins of the main chapel, where the roof had long since collapsed, leaving the altar open to the wrath of the sky. Silas stood beside the stone altar, calm and composed amidst the tempest. He held Martha in front of him, a long, sharp knife pressed gently against her throat. She was terrified, but her chin was held high, her defiance a silent rebuke to her captor. "Welcome, Marshal," Silas shouted over the howl of the wind. "I'm so pleased you could attend the final sermon." "Let her go, Blackwood," Jedediah yelled back, his pistol leveled. "This is between you and me." "Oh, it has always been between you and me," Silas said, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. "But a man's sins should be witnessed. She is here to see you for what you truly are. Not a hero, not a lawman. Just a man who lets women die to protect his own pride." He pulled the silver locket from his pocket, dangling it before Martha's eyes. "Do you see this a gift from his wife to mine? A promise of friendship between two good women." He let them both burn, then locked this away, as if it were his. He mourns what he lost, but he has never once repented for what he took. The full, twisted truth of it hit Jedediah. The locket wasn't stolen treasure. It was Silas's symbol of everything Jedediah had cost him. He was a man so consumed by his own grief that he had rewritten history to cast himself as its righteous avenger. "You have one last choice." "Jedediah," Silas snarled, pulling Martha closer. The knife pricked her skin, and a single drop of blood welled on its surface. "Your past is a ghost that has haunted you for 5 years. Tonight you can either banish it or become it. Revert to the cold-blooded killer they whispered about in the territories. Kill me. Let vengeance consume you, just as it has consumed me. or uphold your precious failed law and watch another innocent woman die because you hesitated. The dust swirled momentarily, obscuring everything. The bell tolled a frantic, desperate rhythm. Jedediah stood on the precipice of his own soul. The stakes were no longer just life and death. They were about justice versus revenge, damnation versus redemption. The killer from his past was clawing at the door, begging to be let out. And in the heart of the storm, he had to decide which man he was going to be. The wind shrieked a physical force that sought to tear the world apart. Dust and debris swirled through the chapel ruins, turning the air into a suffocating, blinding fog. The broken bell tolled its chaotic hymn, each clang a hammer blow against Jedediah's resolve. He could barely see Silas, a dark shape holding a darker promise, the glint of the knife, a malevolent star in the gloom. What will it be? Marshal Silas's voice was a venomous hiss, cutting through the storm. The lawman who failed, or the avenger who succeeds, choose. Jedediah's finger tightened on the trigger. The cold logic of survival screamed at him to shoot. A clean shot and it saved Martha. It would be so easy. It would be vengeance swift and satisfying. The man who had haunted his past and destroyed his present would be gone. But as he looked at Martha's face, at her unflinching eyes, he saw not a victim pleading for rescue, but a woman of faith holding fast against the devil himself. Her gaze was a challenge, do not become him to save me. He lowered his pistol a fraction of an inch. This isn't justice, Silas. It's just more grief. Silas laughed a sound as mad and broken as the tolling bell. Grief is all that's left. It's the currency of the world you created. He shoved Martha forward, using her as a shield as he drew his own pistol. The move was fast, desperate. Jedediah fired not at Silas's heart, but at the stone floor beside his feet. The bullet ricocheted with a high-pitched whine. The unexpected tactic worked. Silas flinched, his balance compromised for a split second. It was the only opening Jedediah needed. He lunged forward, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides. He slammed into Silas, driving him away from Martha. The knife clattered against the stone floor. Martha stumbled back, gasping, and scrambled for the relative safety of a crumbling archway. Now it was just the two of them, 2 men forged in the same fire, locked in a brutal primal struggle. They crashed against the stone altar, fists flying. Silas was wiry and quick, fueled by years of simmering rage. Jedediah was stronger, but the years of disuse had taken their toll. His breath came in ragged bursts, his movements lacking their former precision. The dust storm was their accomplice and their enemy. A sudden gust would blind them, and they would break apart, circling each other like phantom wolves until the world became visible again. Silas landed a blow to Jedediah's ribs, and Jedediah felt a sharp, searing pain. He answered with a right cross that sent Silas staggering back, blood trickling from his lip. "You feel it, don't you?" Silas spat, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "The rage, the power. This is who you truly are." He dove for his fallen pistol. Jedediah kicked it away, sending it skittering into the darkness. Enraged, Silas pulled a concealed knife from his boot and lunged. Jedediah parried the thrust with his forearm, and the blade slicing through his duster and drawing blood. He grunted in pain, grabbed Silas's wrist and twisted. Bones ground together. Silas cried out, but his grip on the knife held. They wrestled for control of the blade, their faces inches apart. In the swirling dust, Jedediah could see the profound, bottomless agony in Silas's eyes. This wasn't a monster. This was a man, a husband, a father, hollowed out by loss and filled with poison. "She's gone, Silas," Jedediah gasped, the wind stealing his words. "Your family. Sarah. None of this will bring them back. Then I will join them." Silas screamed, putting all his weight into one final desperate thrust. The old bell in the tower, weakened by the storm, finally broke from its rusted moorings. With a groan of tortured metal, the massive bronze bell plunged through the rotten timbers of the belfry, crashing down into the chapel. It landed with a deafening, earth-shattering boom not 10 feet from where they fought, sending a shower of splintered wood and stone fragments in all directions. The shockwave threw both men apart. Jedediah landed hard on his back, the air driven from his lungs. Silas was thrown against the altar, his head striking the stone with a sickening crack. He lay still, the knife slipping from his limp fingers. Jedediah pushed himself up his body, screaming in protest. The storm was beginning to abate, the wind's howl softening to a mournful moan. The dust began to settle, revealing the scene in the eerie post-apocalyptic light. Silas was alive, but unconscious, a gash on his temple. Martha was safe, huddled but unharmed. Jedediah stood over the man who had been his tormentor. The avenger inside him, the ghost of his rage, urged him to finish it. Pick up the gun. End the pain. But he looked at his own trembling, bloody hands, and then at Martha, and finally he thought of Cody. He thought of the unfinished wooden bird in his pocket. Vengeance was an ending. Justice, however imperfect, was a beginning. He holstered his Colt. He had made his choice. As the last of the dust settled, the sound of approaching horses reached them. A posse. Deputy Miller, against all odds, had followed him. Jedediah had left a trail, a series of subtle signs only a trained tracker would notice, hoping the boy was smart enough to read them. It seemed he was. Miller and 3 other men rode into the mission courtyard, their faces grim. They found Jedediah standing over the unconscious form of Silas Blackwood, with Martha Greaves slowly walking toward him. "It's over, son," Jedediah said, his voice thick with exhaustion. They took Silas into custody, binding his hands and loading him onto a horse. He was alive, and he would face the law. Jedediah had chosen justice. His war was finally over. He walked over to Martha, who looked at him with tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Jedediah." "I'm the one who should be thanking you," he said softly. He bent down and picked up the silver locket from the dusty floor. He held it in his palm, its metal cool against his skin. It was just a thing, a piece of silver and memory. It held no power over him anymore. He helped Martha onto his horse and began the slow ride back to the Greaves' homestead, leading the horse through the quiet aftermath of the storm. The world felt scrubbed clean, the air crisp and new. As they crested the final ridge, he saw the light of a lantern shining in the cabin window. A beacon, a promise of home. Elias and Cody were waiting. The days that followed were quiet, filled with the simple, sacred work of healing. The posse took Silas Blackwood back to Redemption to await a federal judge. Deputy Miller, his face showing a newfound respect and maturity, shook Jedediah's hand before they left a silent acknowledgement passing between the old lawman and the new. Jedediah's wounds began to mend, but the deeper healing took place in the small moments, sharing a silent breakfast with Elias, helping Martha replant her herb garden, and watching Cody's fear finally give way to the unburdened laughter of a child. The boy followed Jedediah everywhere, a small devoted shadow. The homestead, which had once seemed like a dangerous complication, now felt like an anchor. About a week after the storm, Jedediah knew what he had to do. He rode into Redemption, the silver locket heavy in his pocket. The town looked different now, not a place of exile, but just a place. He bypassed the main street and rode directly to the cemetery on the hill. The small, weathered headstone stood beneath a lonely cypress tree. Sarah Kane, beloved wife. The words were so simple, so inadequate. For 5 years he had visited this spot as a penitent, laying his guilt upon the cold stone like a withered wreath. Today was different. He knelt in the grass and took out the locket. He polished its dusty surface with his thumb, the engraved willow tree seeming to shimmer in the afternoon light. He didn't open it. He no longer needed to. He gently placed it on top of the headstone, letting it rest against the carved name. It was not his to keep. It belonged to the past, to the memory of 2 women whose friendship had been consumed by a tragedy he could not undo, but had finally stopped perpetuating. It was an act of letting go. Of Sarah. Of his guilt. Of the ghost of Marshall Kane. He stood up, feeling a profound lightness in his chest. He turned to leave and saw them waiting for him at the cemetery gate. Elias, Martha, and Cody stood beside their wagon, their presence a silent, unwavering invitation. He walked toward them, not as a man riding off into the sunset, but as a man walking toward a sunrise. The ride back to the homestead was quiet, filled with an unspoken understanding. When they arrived, he saw that a section of the barn's corral fence had been damaged in the storm, its rails splintered and sagging. Without a word, Jedediah walked to the tool shed. He returned with a hammer and a handful of nails. He picked up a fallen rail, set it in place, and with a steady, resounding blow, began to drive the first nail home. The sound echoed in the crisp air, not the crack of a gunshot, but the sound of something being built. Of a man choosing not to dwell on the ruins of his past, but to mend the fences of his future.